All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Monday, February 22nd. Good weekend? You mean what? 2 days off? No school?
Well, in the middle of the term, it's not gonna be a fun week
It's not going to be a fun week?
at all.
No, just work?
Of course.
Is it midterm? There's midterm week now.
Well,
Or it just started?
there's really no such thing as midterm week.
No, like the week where they do tests and all. I just named it midterm week because it's just like that.
Yeah, it kind of depends where people choose to put midterms. Like,
But are most of them done?
well, it depends, right? Because we're halfway. This is like halfway through the term right now, and so if you were gonna schedule a midterm, it should probably be about halfway. But some classes do 2 midterms, so they'll have an earlier and a later midterm. In my anthropology class that I teach, I usually do go for a late midterm, so I usually wait till week 8 to do my midterm. So it's all over the place, but we're halfway through. So, if we were going to have a midterm, this would be a good time, but we're not doing that. So, all right, let me say good morning to some people who are here. Michelle is here. Good morning, Michelle. Irina's here. Good morning to you. Noah's here. Good morning. Hadil is here. Good morning, Hadil. Mulder's here. Hello there, Mulder. And Basil is here. Good morning to you. I'm not sure who this person is, Amin, but good morning to you. Okay, let's jump in. On Friday we were coming to the end of our India chapter, and there's certainly much more to talk about. India has a history that goes back thousands of years. They have multiple religious traditions, right? We've talked about Buddhism and Hinduism and Jainism. There are others, but it's a very kind of culturally rich, complex part of the world. And again, it's got a long history, and unfortunately in a 13-week course that deals with a bunch of different civilizations, we don't have time to really dig into it. But I think we've gotten we've been able to take a few things from it. On Friday we were talking about kind of the first Indian empire that appears under this gentleman here, Chandragupta Maurya, who kind of unites India or most of India under his rule, but then decides to go off and become a Jain monk and starves himself to death, which is kind of an uncomfortable end to that story. But he's going to be eventually succeeded by his grandson here, Ashoka. And we said Ashoka was a pretty notable historical figure because of the type of empire he tries to create, right? Most empires are created sort of based on threats, right? Based on the sword. Do what we say or we'll come in with our army and cut you to pieces, right? But Ashoka he starts out that way, of course, but he comes to the idea that, there's a lot of suffering that system brings. Can we do it better? Can we have a society that is more peaceful and harmonious and non-violent and, that doesn't injure people or animals? And so he kind of has he has a total change of heart, in fact. And so he, of course, travels around just like the Buddha did. He sits beneath the Bodhi tree just like the Buddha did. And he kind of comes to some ideas about how he would like to govern his empire, right? And so we watched that section of the documentary on Friday, I think it was on Friday. And so we heard a little bit about how we sort of came to know the story of Ashoka. So it was, again, the deciphering of an ancient Brahmini script that allowed us to kind of learn about the history of this person, Ashoka. Yeah, there's a picture of some of this script. We hear the story of him feeling that war and violence is kind of it's a loss for everyone. It's a tragedy for everyone. And so he kind of borrows from Buddhist principles. He borrows from Jain principles. And he decides to try to create an empire in which he's kind of the father and all people are his children, right? And so he tries to create an empire of love, if you will, which is a pretty revolutionary idea for for any time in history. Good morning. For any time in history, this is a revolutionary idea, but particularly for thousands of years ago, this is brand new, right? This has never really been attempted before. But of course, for the world we live in now, we can kind of look back and we can see a lot of ideas that might align with us or that might inspire us, right? The idea of human rights, the idea of animal rights, the idea that, I can't speak for all countries, of course, but here in Canada and mostly the US, we don't rule by violence, right? We rule by persuasion, by voting, by debating with each other. We don't have wars every couple of years to figure out who's the boss, right? We don't do that. And so we might look back to the story of India and the empire of Ashoka and try to find some inspiration there. And it's kind of interesting that we don't. Most Westerners, I don't think, have any idea who Ashoka is or what he did. And instead it's very interesting that the West, and particularly the United States, they look back to Greece and particularly to Rome in terms of an inspiration for their civilization, for their country. The Americans in particular are heavily influenced by the Roman Republic, but we'll talk about that in a few more weeks. But it's very interesting, kind of the world we live in, that we aren't more conscious of what Ashoka did with his empire and the sort of values he tried to instill. I feel like this is an empire that's sort of more aligned with what modern countries would like to be, as opposed to some other empires from the past that we might be inspired by that actually were not that great. I don't know. Right, so we learned about Ashoka. He created an empire. He put up all of these edicts, right? An edict is sort of a thing that the king says, a pronouncement, and he inscribed them on these giant pillars, right? And they're scattered all around India, sort of proclaiming to the people that they live under the rule of Ashoka, and this is how Ashoka will govern them, right? So it's a little bit of I guess it's kind of a constitution before constitutions existed, right? So constitutions tell people how their country is to be run and how it's organized, and this is kind of what Ashoka is doing. This is where you live. You live in the empire of Ashoka, and this is how I will rule over you. So I think it serves a similar function, I guess. Again, we said that this empire that was characterized by Chandragupta Maurya and his son Bindusara, and then his grandson Ashoka, kind of fell apart and decentralized, right? Empires in this period are very hard to hold on to. Communication is not that great. You've got lots of people vying for power, and it's just hard to sort of organize everyone and keep them together. And so the empire is sort of kept together under these three rulers, the father, the son, and the grandson. But after that, things fall apart. The kings aren't quite as motivated or quite as interested in governing, or maybe they're just incompetent. But either way, the thing kind of decentralizes and falls apart. And the video said that the wheel of, I think the wheel of law was what they call it, Ashoka's wheel of law, is actually featured in the modern Indian flag. And so modern India has kind of connected themselves to that past. Whether or not that's a reasonable connection to make is another story, but they've connected themselves to that history through their flag, right? I asked you to read this, I think, but we kind of ran out of time on Friday, if I recall. So can I give you about 6 minutes or so? Maybe 8 minutes. 8 minutes just to read over this again very quickly, and then we can talk about it. 9 minutes? Is that what you said? Okay, 9 minutes. We will look over this again, and then we will talk about the answers to these questions, okay? Let's do it. just another minute or two, okay? Okay, maybe let's talk about some of this. There's a lot going on in this section, but there's just a few things that I think we should pull out. So the first question I have for you here is why did Buddhism become popular after the Buddha died? What are some of the things that allowed Buddhism to become popular in India, at least initially? Right, so there were these little monasteries, right? These little groups of Buddhist nuns and Buddhist monks popping up, and those were funded by people with money, right? Kings at first, and then later regular people. Why were kings throwing money at these Buddhist monasteries? Were they just being nice? Why were priests funding these monasteries? Why were they throwing money at these Buddhist monasteries? What was the reason? Were they just being nice? To have a better future for it? Yeah, maybe in a way. But I think it had to do, Mulder says here, it had to do with karma, right? What does it have to do with karma?
They donate the good thing, and because it's a good thing to donate, the good thing will come back to you.
Yeah, so we know that karma is this kind of concept in which if you do good things, it will result in a better rebirth for you in your future lives, right? And so how do you do good things? Well, you can actually do good deeds yourself, but you can also support these Buddhist monks, right? Because they're out there doing good deeds as well. And so if you support them, then that karma will be reflected on you. You'll be doing something good as well, which I kind of think that we do something like that today, right? Many of us don't want to go out and sort of do charitable work because we're all very busy, I'm sure. And so what do? Well, we donate to charity, right? And when we donate to charity, we feel good about it because we're not actually doing anything charitable, right? We're not actually physically helping someone, but we're providing money so that other people can help them, right? And so we kind of get a little bit of that good feeling. We get a feeling that we're doing something good by donating to charity. And here's kind of the same concept, a couple of thousand years ago, where kings and later other people too feel that if they provide money to these Buddhist monasteries, the Buddhists will engage in good works and they will sort of accrue karma, and that karma will be reflected on the people who allow these monks to do this sort of stuff, right? By giving them money for food and money to help the poor and all the things that these Buddhists are doing, right? So karma is kind of part of the reason why people support these Buddhist monasteries. But what else do you think was attractive about Buddhism for Indians in 2,000 or 2,500 years ago? What was attractive about Buddhism?
Is it because anyone can get into religion? You don't need to have royal blood to be Buddhist.
Yeah, the sort of religion that develops from the Vedic Aryans and that will eventually kind of evolve into Hinduism, it has very sort of rigid varnas, right? It has very rigid social groups, and the people who kind of practice religion and are involved with religious rites, those are the Brahmins, right? Those are the people at the top of society. And so in other varnas, you don't really have quite so much of a role in the religion of the society. But here with Buddhism, in theory, anyone can do it, right? If you understand, if you know the Eightfold Path, if you understand the Four Noble Truths, and if you follow them, anyone can do this, right? Anyone can practice Buddhism, and in theory, as they point out later, anyone could be a Buddha, right? If you are able to meditate and if you're able to reflect on the Noble Truths, you could attain enlightenment. You could attain nirvana. Anyone could do it, right? That was the whole point of the Buddha figuring that out. He was asking, how do we release ourselves from this cycle of suffering? And to his mind, he figures it out, right? He releases himself from suffering. And so if he can do it, anyone else can do it as well, right? If they just kind of work hard enough at it. And so there's a real kind of element of, I guess, meritocracy or democracy or something, that it is kind of open to anyone who chooses to practice and follow the path. They can be a Buddhist, and they can potentially or hopefully eventually attain enlightenment just like the Buddha did, right? And so that might be attractive as well, right? It's a very inclusive spiritual path rather than the sort of Hinduism system, which was very kind of exclusive according to the Varnas, maybe. So out of the Buddha's teaching, eventually we get kind of a few different traditions of Buddhism, and the two main ones are the Theravada and Mahayana versions. And what's the difference between these two? What's the Theravada Buddhism about? Yeah, it's about teaching, following and understanding the Four Noble Truths that the Buddha had presented to us. Yeah. The what? Yeah, it's kind of, I guess, maybe the Mahayana groups would disagree, but it's kind of the more of the original form, right? It's based more directly on what the Buddha actually said and did and wrote, right? And so it's the Eightfold Path, it's the Four Noble Truths, and it's the, meditating to attain enlightenment and free yourself from the cycle of suffering, right? But how's the Mahayana one different?
They say the great vehicle, and they explain everyone can. Yeah, everybody can make or follow whatever he wants.
Not so much that. There's a couple of things, right? There's what's going on here? There's a few things with this Mahayana version. Right. So yeah. So there's this idea that, the Buddha says that, if you practice and reflect and meditate, you can become enlightened. And if so, you can become a Buddha. And if so, that means that there's not just one Buddha, there's probably a bunch of Buddhas, right? A bunch of people who have attained nirvana, who have attained enlightenment. And so what else is happening that's a little bit different?
The people's point is don't necessarily have to follow the Eightfold Path or Noble Truths.
Right. So the doctrine of each of these kind of paths may have changed and evolved a little bit. That's true. What about the worshiping of Buddhas? Yeah, a little bit, right? There's kind of offerings that are made to Buddhas or to the original Buddha, and those offerings are meant to sort of show that you are kind of serious about pursuing enlightenment, right? And that's kind of weird. It's not weird, but according to the original kind of more Theravada Buddhism, that's an odd thing, right? The original Buddha would not have wanted to be worshipped, right? But the Mahayana version does worship Buddhas or does make offerings to them in order to demonstrate your seriousness or the fact that you are trying to attain nirvana or enlightenment, right? So again, it's a little bit of a different thing. And this happens with religions. They kind of evolve and change over time. Yeah.
Is it monk or lay follower is welcome to make an offering before an image of Buddha placed?
Uh-huh. What does that mean? That means that they had images of the Buddha in shrines or in holy places, and you could go and make an offering. And so it might be money, you might leave some food, you might leave flowers. Any of these things could be left as like a little mini sacrifice to the god, to the Buddha. And anyone could do it. So if you were a monk, so if you were like hardcore Buddhist, you could do this. But even if you were a lay person, so someone who practiced Buddhism but you weren't a monk, you weren't full-time full-time Buddhist. So anyone could do this sort of thing. You've done it before? Yeah. What did you? How did it go? Like, can you describe it to us?
Because my mom, she's kind of like Buddhist, and so we in our house we have like statues of like different gods.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just food; you can put like incense too. That works too.
Right.
And yeah, it's just you have to be respectful.
This might not be in your part of the world, but is there's also another custom I've heard of in which you have to make sure your head doesn't go higher than the Buddha. So you sort of, maybe you put the Buddha up on the shelf, but you make sure that your head never goes above the head of the Buddha. Is that a thing? Yeah. Does what you've experienced, does it sound more like the Mahayana version, or the?
Yeah, the Mahayana.
Yeah. Very interesting. That's cool. Do we have anything else we want to say about these two variants of Buddhism before we move on? No? Okay, let's go to number 3 here. So Hinduism continues to develop. So again, the sort of foundation of Hinduism is kind of the indigenous people, but also those Indo-Aryans that come in thousands of years before, and their religious traditions kind of evolve over time into what we now know as Hinduism. And so what are these Dharma Scriptures that they talk about? Or what is Dharma? What is Dharma? Their belief, yeah. Okay, give me more than that then.
A set of policies that Mahaya's name,
The what?
Chandra.
Chandragupta? Does he have anything to do with it? Right. So it's kind of, I guess, the idea of Dharma is that everyone has kind of a role that they have to fulfill in society, right? So whether you're a man or a woman, or depending on your gender, depending on your varna or your caste, everyone has kind of a role that they have to play, right? And that role, the duty to perform that role is Dharma, right? And so, I might be, I'm just going to use my own life as an example. If I was born into a teaching caste, which I was not, but if I was, that would be my occupation, right? And I'm also a man, so I'd be expected to teach school like I am, but I'd also be expected to, have a wife and children and contribute to my community, and then eventually retire, and in this case, I guess, wander around and devote myself to God, sort of thing. But that would all be kind of, I would have a life plan sort of laid out for me, right? And it would be my duty to kind of follow that plan and to behave in ways that are ethically and morally preferred. Yes? No? Am I okay? Sorry, the look on your face was a little bit like, no? What's that?
Confusing.
I was explaining it in a confusing way? Or the idea is confusing? The idea?
Still kind of confusing.
Well, and I will admit to it too, because I'm not an expert in Hinduism or Dharma by any means. And so this is kind of how I'm trying to understand it, is that everyone has a role to play in society, in their family, and they're kind of expected to follow that, right? They have to do the right thing, right? Do what is right, do what is expected of you, do what your society and your culture and your caste or your varna. Do what is demanded of you. Which is interesting, right? Because, I can't speak for all of your cultures out there, but Western culture is very much not like that, right? Western culture, this idea of Dharma is a very kind of collective, community-based idea, right? Society is depending on you, Baha, to follow your Dharma, to do your duty. So do it, right? That's kind of what's being said here. But what's Western culture like? Western culture is more individualistic, right? What's that?
Do whatever you want.
Do whatever you want, right? You do you, right? That's what people say, do they not? They say you do you, right? The Dharma says is you do your Dharma, right? You do what society and culture and religion expects of you as a human in society. You have a duty. Do your duty, right? Here in the West, we say, yeah, you do you. Do whatever you want, right? I'm not necessarily saying one is better or worse, but I'm just contrasting two kind of very different outlooks on how people should live their lives, right? According to the Dharma or according to, I don't know, your heart or your whim or whatever we say here in the West. So yeah, kind of a very different approach to how to live your life, right? What do we learn about the roles of men and women from these Dharma scriptures? Let's start with men. What are men supposed to be or supposed to do? Yeah, we're supposed to work, right? So all of us will be born into a varna, born into a caste, and so that will determine what our work is, whether we're community leaders or warriors or priests or farmers or craftsmen or whatever we happen to be. We will be born into a caste and an occupation, and we will have to do that. What else?
Well, you for types of life, periods.
Oh, okay.
Student, then husband, then teacher.
Yeah, what are those 4 stages of life? The student,
Student, householder, hermit, renunciant.
the householder, the hermit, and the renunciant. Close. Yeah, so all men are kind of expected to go through this period of life, right? Where they're young and they're learning their craft, whatever their occupation is, they have to learn how to do it, right? The householder, right? Where they're a husband and a father and a head of a household, someone who contributes to the community. Then someone who's a hermit, right? Someone who has done their work, raised their kids, and then they're kind of like stepping out of society, right? They're kind of getting out of the way so that the next generation of householders can come forward, right? So they're kind of stepping back, keeping to themselves, and then they're a renunciant, right? So they're renouncing worldly things and just kind of wandering around, meditating and devoting themselves to God. I'm not sure. So you kind of see this it's almost like this generational cycle, right? There's this, one generation are students and they learn their craft, they become the householder, the sort of main force in society, and then they kind of step away, right? So that a new generation of students can become householders, right? And so you can see this kind of very cyclical path. It's almost like the transmigration thing, right? Of death and rebirth, right? Over and over again. And here we see society is kind of is dying and being reborn as well, right? From student to householder to hermit to renunciant and then to death. And then, a new generation comes behind it, right? So all these things are kind of operating in a cyclical fashion, and they're kind of spelled out for you, which again is kind of interesting because, I think we kind of have that here in the West, right? People are young and they go to school and then they get a career and maybe a marriage and a house and things like that, and then they retire and then they It's kind of, I guess, putter around the house, I'm not sure, but there's kind of that idea, I think, in many of our countries as well. But here it's pretty clearly spelled out for people, right, in terms of, or for men, in terms of what they should do. What else? Men. So men have this life cycle, they have an occupation, a varna and a caste that they're born into. They're property holders.
Then they become
Yes, I think all of them could be thought of that way, I think. But yeah, particularly toward the end. Well, what about women? What do we learn about women?
they were content in a way.
Hmm.
But they have to follow their fathers and their husbands.
Yep. So so women are to be honored and supported, but they're very much dependent on men, right? First their father, and then once they become married, then their husband, right? So men are definitely the dominant gender in this society. Women are kind of subservient, and they have kind of a life path of their own. Women do, right? They have stages that they have to go through as a young person, and then a wife and a mother, and then actually I'm not really sure what happens to them at the end. Do they just wander around with their husbands? Doesn't actually spell that out very well. Oh, yeah, and in some cases they are. Yeah, if their husband should die, they're to remain celibate, so no sexual activity. And then we even hear reports about women throwing themselves on their husband's funeral pyre, right? So men are cremated here in this culture and society here, and sometimes their wives are burned with them. What is that called? There's a word. Well, that would be similar. That would be similar, which is unfortunate for women because statistically they tend to live longer than men anyway. But what is it called? It has a name. The widow being burned on the cremation fire of the husband. It's called. Shoot. Okay. There's a term for it, particularly in Indian culture, but I cannot remember what it's called. It's okay. Okay, and last thing we hear about kind of the three most popular gods in Hinduism. So we learned that there are lots and lots and lots of Hindu gods and sort of supernatural entities in this religion, but there's kind of three main ones, and who are they? Rama is an expression of one of the gods, or an embodiment of one. But what's that god's more popular name? What? Nope, not Rama. There's a story about the Ramayana, and so Rama is kind of a Gilgamesh-like hero, if you will.
Oh, they say Rama defeated the Dharma.
He defeated who?
The Dharma.
Yes, but he's not the actual god. He's just he's kind of seen like it's tricky because it's almost like when we talked about ancient Egypt where the pharaoh is kind of like Horus, but he's not Horus. So Shiva is one, right? And what's one of Shiva's jobs? Yeah, so Shiva's in some ways a protector, but also a destroyer, right? So again, there's this idea that the universe is cyclical and it is constantly destroyed and recreated and destroyed and recreated. And so you need someone who is in charge of the destruction, right? And that is Shiva, right? How's the universe reborn? Nope. So Vishnu destroys the universe. Brahma rebuilds or recreates the universe, and who kind of maintains it in the meantime? Vishnu, right? So there's these kind of three stages of, the universe is kind of maintained for a while, then it is destroyed, and then it is recreated again, right? And so Brahma and Vishnu and Shiva all have, a role in this maintenance of the universe, right? And again, they're in charge of other things, right? People pray to Vishnu and to Shiva and Brahma for other things, but this is kind of their main role in maintaining the universe. Which again is interesting, because if you look at monotheistic religions like Judaism or Christianity or Islam, there's really no such idea that the universe is cyclical, right? Most of those religions believe that the universe was created, right? God or Yahweh or Allah or Jehovah, they created the universe, and then the universe is here, and they're in charge of it. And then eventually there will be, well, for Christians anyway, there will be a judgment at the end. But I don't know that means that the universe will be destroyed. I don't think that's part of it. Yeah. Yeah. But that's not the end of the universe. That's kind of just the end of, I guess, life on Earth. I think is that what it's implying? Right. Okay. So so those religions believe that there's a hell like place, there's an earth, and then there's a heaven, right? And so on the day of judgment, that earth place will kind of be over, and then people will be sorted into heaven and hell, and that will stay that way for eternity, I guess. Yeah. So that's kind of a very different sequence, right? That's kind of a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, although the end goes on to infinity, but it's still a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But this story is interesting because, again, it's cyclical, right? Just like transmigration, it happens over and over and over again. The universe is created and destroyed and then created again. So again, it's a very different way of thinking about the nature of the universe, and also a very different way of conceiving of how the gods are involved. Especially here because we have two traditions, one that believes that gods are in charge of the universe, that's Hinduism, and then the Buddhists and the Jains who feel that, the universe just does this thing on its own, and gods have to follow the rules of the universe just like us people do. So again, you have very different conceptions of how the universe works, who's in control of it, and kind of what's the nature of reality. So cool. Okay, you want to take a little break? What was that? No? Okay, let's take a little break, and we'll come back and we'll wrap up India, okay? So, just finished talking about this section of the textbook on the sort of attractiveness of Buddhism in the sort of 400s BCE, and how it was kind of monasteries were supported by people because it generated good karma for themselves, but also because it's kind of a more inclusive religious tradition, right? And so if you were sort of a more Brahmanic Hinduism practitioner, you may be sort of shut out of certain aspects of religious life, but Buddhism sort of welcomed everyone, and anyone could technically become a Buddha, right? We talked about the two variants, Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism, and then we talked about the idea that there's kind of three main gods in Hinduism. There's lots of them, of course, but the three ones kind of deal with the maintenance of the cycle of the universe, right? The destruction and the rebirth and the maintenance of that newly reborn universe. Right, so we just talked about all these things. That's good. That's good. Men and women. Here's Vishnu. I just wanted to show you. Indian religion and culture is very colorful, which I enjoy. They're very comfortable using really bold, really bright, saturated colors, and you see lots of that here. And so here's a representation of Vishnu, and of course we said Vishnu was responsible for kind of maintaining and preserving the universe as it is, right? Here's our friend Shiva. Shiva's is a protector but also a destroyer, right? And so Shiva will destroy the universe at the end of a cycle, allowing Brahma, of course, to recreate the universe over again, right? So these three kind of participate in the cycle of the universe, and it's interesting, right? It's interesting to see how different cultures and different religions divide up the world, right? There's no reason why, one god couldn't have run the universe, but here we have three, right? And each one is kind of responsible for a different phase of that cycle of the universe. Yeah, kind of interesting. So these are three separate gods, but in a way they're a manifestation of the same thing, right? They're different facets of the expression or the sort of operation of the universe and the cosmic cycle of life and death. And so sometimes we can think about these gods as, discrete characters, discrete different things, but we can also think of them as expressions of one thing, right? So it's, how you look at it depends on a lot of different factors. Right, so, sorry, let me just see, I just want to look at my slides and see where I am and what comes next here before I say something else. Right, okay, so Shiva, Vishnu, and Brahma. All right, so these are kind of the things that we said we were going to try to pay attention to at the beginning of this chapter, or the beginning of this unit on India. So culture and environment, we said we were going to pay attention to politics a little bit, power, authority, and governance, a little bit about interaction and exchange, conflict and conflict resolution, values and beliefs. So what have we, let's summarize India as best we can. What have we learned about culture and environment, all the way from the Indus River Valley civilization through to the Indo-Aryans, and then the Vedic age, and into the empire of the Mauryans, right, of Chandragupta and so on. What have we learned about culture and environment, and connections between the physical environment and the culture itself? Right? Okay. I'm just going to repeat what you said before I forget it here, just for online people. So you're saying, yeah, we have this kind of long historical tradition that in many cases is polytheistic, so there's multiple gods. There is lots of conflict and warfare that happens. That's definitely true. What did we hear about the environment? Yeah. Oh, okay. So the way people made their living, the Indo-Aryans were pastoralists, right? They had herds of what? Cows. Yeah, they had herds of cows, right? So the Indo-Aryans did some farming, but they also herded cows, right? What else did we learn about culture and environment?
They were a bit developed from other cultures, where they had their own sphere system. For example, where they developed product inside.
Right. So the Indus River Valley civilization was very kind of politically and economically centralized, but also pretty technologically advanced as well, right? And so they had all kinds of irrigation systems for their crops, but also sewage systems for their stuff, right? To get it out of the city, which again was very advanced for the time. Again, you won't see sewage systems in a city until you get to Rome, and that's like 3,000 years after these guys. What else?
They have governments or governors that have different ideas than others, or they have changed as we saw. No one can change it.
Okay, so in terms of governance, we could say that India kind of had periods of centralization and decentralization, right? So the Indus River Valley civilization seems to have been centralized, and then things became kind of decentralized when the Indo-Aryans came in. We had a bunch of governors and kingdoms and rajas and things at one point, but then those kingdoms were all kind of collected together under Chandragupta and Bindusara and Ashoka, right? But then, things kind of decentralized again. So we have this kind of, up and down where one ruler is able to take control, and then, it all kind of falls apart, and we have little smaller kingdoms and governors kind of running different parts, right? So yeah, it's been an up and down process.
Also, we can say about them, they were adapted to the environment they were in, as we saw it. Buddhism started away from one man and then dominated the rest of the area. So they mentioned that in the textbook.
Yeah, well, we could almost probably put that into interactions and exchanges, right? Where one man, right, Siddhartha Gautama, one man roaming around northern India teaching, actually created a world religion, right? Which is pretty astonishing. It's not the first time it ever happened. It might be the last, I don't know, but it's not the first time that a single person has spawned an entire religious tradition, but it's pretty impressive that it did, right? And so his teachings, and then the teachings of his followers or disciples that came later, that was hugely influential in the history of India, but also in spreading that religion beyond India, right? And Buddhism is a major world religion now, thanks to Siddhartha Gautama, right? What else can we say about any of these, really?
I think they were very reliant on creating other societies because they were big and they were more developed than others, and they were beside rivers and had more resources. They had enough for them.
Yeah, they were in contact with other parts of the world, right? They were in contact with Mesopotamia and with cultures in Central Asia, but they probably didn't rely on them, right? Like nowadays we live in a globalized world and we rely on international trade for everything, right? We saw that happen at the beginning of the pandemic where suddenly, we couldn't get cotton swabs for COVID tests because cotton swabs are made in China, right? And we couldn't get masks because those are made in China as well, right? And so our kind of global system for a second, looked problematic. But this is back in a time where really the things that are getting traded are luxury items, right? Only the people with money can really pay for the things that are imported, right? Most people are just kind of living their lives very simply, trading with people around them for things that they need, food or technologies. But that long distance trade is really for people with cash. But it's still happening, right? And it happens from the very earliest stages of civilization. So all the way back to the Indus River Valley civilization, people are trading with civilizations thousands of miles away. What else is happening? Or what else can we say about India? What about climate change?
The Indus River Valley civilization experienced climate change, and the solution that they came up with was to move more.
Yeah, so a climate change, a shift in the monsoons, so the seasonal heavy rains that India gets, kind of changed the Indus River Valley civilization, right? They weren't able to get water from the river, they weren't able to irrigate their crops, and they had to leave, right? Even though they'd built these fantastic cities, they had to leave and go elsewhere, right? And so they moved east toward the Ganges River. And of course, that either allowed those Indo-Aryans to come in, or they might have been pushed from, climate changes in their own part of the world, right? So it's kind of interesting to think thousands of years ago that climate is kind of pushing human populations one way or the other, right? If it becomes too dry or too hot, you have to move to a place where you can survive, right? And so people are constantly moving around, moving north and south, east and west, and that's bringing people into contact with new environments, but also with new groups of people, right? And so kind of Indian culture as we know it, and sort of the Hindu religion is actually formed in a way based on climate change, right? Because it brings those new people into India and they start mixing with the indigenous Indians, the people who were there before, right? And so that's all to do with climate change and people having to migrate to find places where they can live, right? What else?
They had conflicts between them and division between parts of India. But I think it did not last too long because they did not focus about it a lot. It did not affect them.
Okay. So it's not, even though I'm sure that there were conflicts and military campaigns, this wasn't really a story of violence and military conquest for the most part, right? It was actually, it was more of a cultural and a spiritual journey, if you will, right? And again, we could spend more time on the conflict part, but that didn't seem to be maybe the important part of India's story. Maybe there are more important parts that we heard about, but I think they happened for sure. What else? What's that?
Farming.
Did you say farming?
Environmental.
Oh, the Varna system, yeah. So the Varna system is important, right? That division of society into Brahmins and Kshatriyas and Vaishyas and Shudras, right? That system remains important for kind of structuring people's lives all the way into the modern age, right? The modern state of India has attempted to outlaw it and get people not to think about that anymore. Some people don't think about it, some people still do, but some variant of that Varna or caste system exists all the way up into the modern all the way up into the modern world. And again, it starts off thousands of years before. Amazing. What else? Varna, so there's Hinduism, it's polytheistic. You've got Buddhism. What was kind of interesting about Buddhism as a spiritual system? It has what? Yes, it has.
It's was the new focus in this chapter. Yeah.
It was. We spent some time with Buddhism. What kind of makes it interesting and different than maybe other world religions?
Because
Probably not like really worshiping a god or like real god,
Yeah.
but it's more like the focus on like reaching nirvana or enlightenment.
Yeah. So the focus was entirely different, right? So the focus in a lot of religions is like, oh, please God, I will honor you and maybe sacrifice to you, and then hopefully you'll do nice things for me, and maybe I will get into paradise. Some form of that. That's a very common sort of theme for world religions. But this one is very different, right? This Buddhism was that if you did your own work, you could free yourself, right? You're not praying, oh God, save me. You're saying, I will save myself. I will liberate myself from this cycle of suffering through my own hard work, right? And again, I'm not saying right or wrong, good or bad, but I am saying that's a very different approach from a lot of world religions, right? And it's a very interesting concept that emerges out of India in this period. And it's something, do you remember you probably don't remember the term, but we use the term transtheistic, right? So monotheistic is one god, polytheistic is multiple gods. This one is transtheistic, and so it's almost beyond gods, right? It's the fact that the universe operates in a predictable way, and you can free yourself from suffering. You can control your own destiny through your own actions and hard work, which again is different, right? It's different from what other religions are trying to do. But it's also interesting in that the idea that you can figure it out, that you can liberate yourself, is also one that's very much in alignment with the Greek philosophers, and they'll come later, or no, will they? Actually, the Greek philosophers will be having these thoughts about the same time, but there's really no obvious connection between the Buddha and Socrates or Aristotle, for instance. But they're both looking at the world around them thinking, we can figure this out, right? If we're observant and careful and we do our own work, we can figure out how the world works. And the Buddha and other thinkers like him, they just go inside, whereas the Greek philosophers go outside and they start kind of almost scientifically studying the world. But they still have the idea that they can figure out the world. Yes, the gods exist, but the universe operates by its own principles. So there's something very interesting happening almost at the same time. These groups, thousands of miles away with no real contact between them, but yet they're kind of doing the same thing, right? They're looking for answers down here rather than up there. Mulder mentions here that the land was very rich and fertile, and yeah, next to those major rivers, the Indus River Valley and the Ganges, it definitely was. And Mulder also says, it's culturally diverse, and that's true too. Even up to today, there's a lot of different traditions and practices and cultures that exist within the Indian subcontinent, and we haven't even touched what's going on there. The sort of richness and complexity is pretty amazing, and we haven't done it justice in any way. What else? We learned a little bit about language. What did we learn about language? Yeah. So the kind of ground level for many of the modern languages that are spoken in that part of the world today is Sanskrit, right? And Sanskrit came in with those Indo-Aryans, and it sort of spread and continued to evolve, and many of the modern languages of the Indian subcontinent are kind of grandchildren languages of that original Sanskrit language, right? And that language is actually connected to a bunch of other ones further back, right? It has great grandparents that are related to other Asian and European languages as well. It's amazing. Is that it? Did we cover most of it? I feel like we kind of did. Yeah. What did you think? Interesting? So? I don't know. I think it's fascinating. I think it's a fascinating part of the world, and I wish I knew more, and hopefully I will continue to learn. Yeah, super cool. Okay. Next. So, our next civilization, culture that we'll explore here is China. And again, we'll be starting off pretty early in Chinese history, kind of going back to the very beginning. And what we'll see is that China has kind of a very similar story to a lot of these other early civilizations. So population growth leads people to sort of collect close to rivers. They start to farm intensively or practice intensive agriculture. And when they do that, they'll create a food surplus, and then social and political and economic complexity will develop, right? So in that way, it's a very similar story to Mesopotamia and Egypt and the Indus River Valley. But of course, China is a different place, and it's going to have different cultural developments, right? So again, we will talk about all these things just like we did with India, okay? So here is China. Has anyone been to China? No? Anyone want to go to China? No, I don't think I want to go right now either. They've taken 2 of my fellow countrymen basically hostage, so I'm a little nervous to go there. Do you know about this? They have 2. The Chinese government is holding 2 Canadians in prison on charges of, I think it's espionage is what they're being held. But they were arrested right after the CFO of Huawei, Meng Wanzhou. After she was arrested here in Canada, the Chinese government arrested 2 Canadians living in China on espionage charges, and they remain in prison. Yeah, well, there's that. That's another thing. Yeah, so there are reasons. I actually would like to see China. I think would be amazing to see, but I'm just a little uncomfortable at the idea of going there right now. But espionage is spying. Yeah. So they're currently being held. I think they've been tried, but I'm not sure where the process is. But they've been stuck there, and it's seen by most people as kind of a hostage situation. So they're saying you release Meng Wanzhou, and we'll release your 2 Canadians. But so far we haven't released her, and they haven't released our 2 Canadians either. So anyway, that's kind of modern China, but ancient China, goes back thousands of years as well. It is a pretty geographically diverse country because it's quite large. It's physically quite large, but it also spans kind of a big territory north-south and also east-west. And so in China, you can find deserts, you can find mountains, you can find temperate forests, you can find hot, humid rainforest. You can find wide open plains. Depending on where you go, China actually looks pretty different, pretty diverse. And so there's a lot of different kind of environments within the country itself. And so, yeah, you can kind of see that represented here, right? If you look on Google Earth, or if you sort of zoom out and look, you'll see, yeah, there's some very dry looking desert right here. There's some mountainous areas to the south where it borders India. If you go to Western China, it's very kind of open and kind of mountainous and a little more dry. If you go to South China, it's very sort of humid and rainforesty. There's all kinds of different environments within this country. When we look at ancient Chinese civilization, there's two kind of important river valleys. And so we've talked about, the Tigris and the Euphrates in Mesopotamia, the Nile in Egypt, the Indus River in the Indus River civilizations. And here we have two main rivers that are important for Chinese history, the Yellow and the Yangtze, okay? And so the Yellow River runs through northern China. It's a place where people started to collect and grow meat and willet. Wheat and millet, not meat and willet. Wheat and millet. And they start to grow these because, again, those are crops that like the dry weather, right? So wheat and millet like sun and dry open air, right? And so people start to grow those crops near the Yellow River, and again, complexity develops, right? So here you can see a map of the Yellow River kind of moving through northern China. There's modern Beijing is right there. But you can see all kinds of ancient archaeological sites or cities or towns that were collected along the river, right? Going back at least as far as ancient Egypt. So we're talking 4, 5, maybe 6,000 years ago. So here's the kind of what the Yellow River looks like, at least at one point. It looks kind of yellow, yellowish brown.
Is it like that, or because it's relatively?
I think it has to do with the dirt that runs off. Yeah, I believe so. Anyway, yeah, there it is.
Not suitable for drinking, or?
I think depending on where you are, it's probably okay. If you're not downstream of a city or town, it's probably all right. If you are, I wouldn't do it. You should probably boil water. But you can see it's got a very characteristic color in some places, and you can see why they called it the yellow. The Yangtze is in the south, and the Yangtze is a place where people started to also collect and grow crops, but here they're more often growing rice, right? Because rice likes things to be a little more wet and humid. That's what the crop wants. And so you can see here that, yeah, the Yellow River is up north, and the Yangtze runs through maybe not the extreme south of China, but further south in China. And yeah, so the Yangtze looks a little something like this, a little bit of a different appearance than the Yellow River. Pretty beautiful, actually. So we have to talk about climate here and a few other things, but I think I will press pause right now because I think that's good enough for today. We only have a minute left anyway. So that is all. We'll wrap it up. Have a nice afternoon, and come back tomorrow, and we will continue to talk about China. Okay, that's it. Goodbye.